When we think of war, we often picture soldiers facing each other on battlefields, tanks rolling across muddy terrain, or aircraft streaking through hostile skies. But beneath this conventional image lies a darker, more insidious form of warfare, one that targets not just enemy combatants, but the very fabric of civilian life and soldier morale. During the Second World War, Germany developed an extensive array of booby traps, concealed explosive devices, and psychological warfare tools that would fundamentally alter how nations thought about unconventional combat. These weren't just weapons designed to kill soldiers. They were instruments of terror, confusion, and demoralization that blurred the lines between combatant and civilian, between the front lines and the home front. The German military, particularly its engineering corps and special operations units, became masters of deception and concealment. They understood something profound about human psychology, that uncertainty and fear could be just as effective as bullets and bombs. A soldier who must question every object, every seemingly innocent item lying on the ground, becomes paralyzed by caution. Civilians who cannot trust the everyday objects in their environment become instruments of their occupiers' control. This was the philosophy behind Germany's extensive booby trap program, a campaign that would leave lasting scars on multiple continents and forever change how military forces approached explosive ordnance disposal. The development of these devices didn't happen in a vacuum. It emerged from Germany's strategic position during the war, particularly as the conflict progressed and the nation found itself increasingly on the defensive. When you cannot match your enemy in terms of raw numbers or resources, you adapt. You find ways to make every casualty count for more. You create situations where the enemy must expend enormous resources to counter relatively simple and cheap devices. You force them to slow down, to second guess, to lose momentum. This was the cold calculus behind the booby trap program. German engineers drew on lessons from the First World War, where static trench warfare had given both sides ample opportunity to experiment with mines and explosive devices. But they took these concepts far beyond simple landmines. They understood that the most effective trap is one that exploits human nature itself. People are naturally curious. They pick up souvenirs. They seek comfort in familiar objects. Soldiers, after months of deprivation in combat zones, are drawn to anything that reminds them of home or promises small luxuries. German trap makers weaponized these very human impulses. The devices themselves ranged from crude to extraordinarily sophisticated. At the simplest level, there were pressure-activated mines disguised as ordinary objects. A brick lying in the street, a piece of firewood in an abandoned building, a bottle of wine left behind in a hastily evacuated position. Each could conceal a deadly surprise. The Germans perfected the art of making these devices look not just innocent, but appealing. They studied what soldiers and civilians would most likely pick up or interact with, then turned those objects into weapons. Among the most psychologically devastating were the items designed to look like luxury goods or comfort items. Chocolate bars represented one of the most insidious examples of this approach. Chocolate was scarce during wartime, particularly in occupied territories and combat zones. For soldiers far from home, a chocolate bar wasn't just food. It was a connection to civilian life, to normalcy, to better times. For children in occupied or recently liberated areas, chocolate represented an almost unimaginable treat. After years of rationing and deprivation, the Germans recognized this emotional and psychological value and weaponized it. The explosive chocolate bars were not crudely made devices. They were carefully engineered to look and feel authentic. The explosive material was typically a thin layer of plastic explosive or other moldable compound concealed within what appeared to be a genuine chocolate bar wrapper. Some versions even included a thin layer of actual chocolate coating the explosive to complete the deception. The detonation mechanism varied. Some used pressure-sensitive switches that would trigger when someone bit down or broke the bar. Others employed pull-activated fuses connected to the wrapper, so that opening the package would initiate the explosion. The resulting blast might not kill someone outright in all cases, but it would cause severe facial and hand injuries, blinding, and psychological trauma. The reasoning behind creating such devices went beyond simple military utility. These were weapons of terror designed to create an atmosphere of pervasive mistrust. When nothing is safe, when even food becomes potentially deadly, people become paralyzed. Soldiers become reluctant to forage or accept gifts from local populations. Civilians become suspicious of abandoned supplies. Children, always the most vulnerable, become victims not just of the immediate blast, but of the broader campaign to destabilize society. The Germans understood that a population living in constant fear is easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to defeat, but we must examine the specific claim about chocolate bars killing British children on Halloween. This requires careful scrutiny. Halloween traditions, as we know them today, were not widely practiced in Britain during the Second World War. Rationing was severe, and trick-or-treating as an organized activity hadn't yet taken hold in British culture as it had in America. The story about Halloween deaths from explosive chocolate specifically lacks documentation and verified historical records from the period. This doesn't mean German booby-trapped chocolate devices didn't exist or didn't cause casualties. Documentary evidence and bomb disposal records confirm that Germany did produce explosive devices disguised as chocolate bars and other food items. However, the specific Halloween narrative appears to be either a conflation of different incidents, a post-war myth that emerged from legitimate fears about German booby traps, or propaganda from the period that has since been repeated as historical fact. What is absolutely verified and documented is that German forces extensively used booby-trapped everyday objects throughout occupied territories and in areas they were forced to evacuate. Explosive devices were concealed in fountain pens that would detonate when someone attempted to write with them. Thermos flasks that exploded when unscrewed. Binoculars rigged to detonate when the focus wheel was adjusted. Cameras that triggered explosives when the shutter button was pressed. Liquor bottles with explosives in the base that would detonate when lifted or poured. These items were deliberately left behind in locations where Allied soldiers would find them during advances into previously German-held territory. The psychological impact of these devices extended far beyond their actual casualty numbers. When a single booby-trapped bottle of cognac kills an officer, word spreads through the entire unit. Suddenly, every abandoned building becomes a potential death trap. Every seemingly innocent object requires careful inspection before handling. This slows military advances. It forces commanders to divert specialized personnel, bomb disposal experts and engineers, to clear areas that should be safe. It creates a climate of paranoia that affects decision-making at every level. A cautious army is a slow army, and in warfare, speed often determines victory or defeat. The training required for Allied forces to counter these threats was extensive and constantly evolving. As bomb disposal teams discovered new types of devices, they had to quickly disseminate information about recognition and disarmament procedures. Training schools were established where soldiers learned to think like the enemy, to spot the subtle signs that an object might be trapped. Slight disturbances in dust patterns. Wires barely visible at the edges of objects. Objects placed in positions that seemed too convenient, too inviting. The Germans continuously evolved their methods, creating devices that exploited the very countermeasures being taught to Allied troops. Secondary devices represented perhaps the most diabolic evolution of booby-trap technology. These were explosives designed to kill the people who came to investigate or disarm the initial trap. A booby-trapped artillery shell would be obvious to a trained disposal expert, but the Germans would place a second device nearby that would detonate when the first was being examined or moved. Sometimes these secondary charges were placed underneath the primary device, triggered by lifting it. Other times they were connected by hidden wires and would explode when the disposal team took cover or moved to a supposed safe position. This meant that bomb disposal work became not just dangerous but required teams to search entire areas around each suspected device, exponentially increasing the time and resources needed to clear any position. The materials science behind these devices was surprisingly sophisticated. German engineers worked with pressure sensors that could be calibrated to different weights, ensuring devices would only trigger when handled by humans rather than being accidentally set off by animals or environmental factors. Time-delayed fuses could be set to detonate hours or even days after installation, allowing German troops to safely evacuate an area before the devices became active. Chemical fuses, using acids eating through restraining materials, provided detonation timing without mechanical clockwork that might be detected. Anti-handling devices made it virtually impossible to move or disarm a booby trap without triggering it. In North Africa, German forces adapted their booby trap techniques to desert warfare conditions. They would bury explosive devices in areas where Allied forces were likely to dig defensive positions. They booby-trapped water sources, knowing that in the desert, soldiers would be desperately drawn to any apparent supply of drinking water. They placed devices in the wreckage of destroyed vehicles, knowing that both soldiers and civilians would scavenge these wrecks for parts, supplies, or shelter from the sun. Each environment presented unique opportunities for exploitation, and German trap specialists became experts at reading terrain and predicting human behavior. The urban environment provided endless opportunities for concealment. In Italian cities, German forces withdrawing ahead of Allied advances would systematically booby-trap buildings. Staircases were rigged to collapse, taking anyone climbing them down into debris-filled basements. Door handles connected to explosives. Floorboards concealing pressure-activated mines. Wine cellars, always attractive to soldiers seeking to relax after combat, became death traps. Churches, which might be used as aid stations or command posts, were sometimes rigged with delayed action charges that would bring down roofs or bell towers. The psychological impact was immense. A city that should represent safety, civilization, and respite from combat instead became as dangerous as the front lines. Children proved particularly vulnerable to these devices, though not through the Halloween chocolate scenario described in your question. In reality, children were victims of booby traps in numerous other documented ways. In occupied territories and areas where fighting had recently occurred, children would explore bombed buildings, seeking anything of value or interest. The Germans, knowing this, would sometimes deliberately place attractive objects, toys or colorful items, in trapped locations. A child's natural curiosity would lead them to investigate, triggering the device. These weren't necessarily devices specifically designed to target children, but the German forces were aware that children would be among the casualties of their booby trap campaigns, and proceeded regardless. This represents a particularly dark chapter in the unconventional warfare of the period. The moral and legal implications of these weapons became a significant issue during and after the war. International law, even as it existed during World War II, contained provisions about weapons that were indiscriminate or that specifically targeted civilians. Booby-trapped objects that appeared to be everyday items existed in a gray area. They could be justified as defensive measures to slow enemy advances, but they also inevitably caused civilian casualties and violated the principle that military operations should distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. After the war, tribunals examined various German military practices and the extensive use of booby traps, particularly those disguised as civilian items, contributed to legal precedents about what constitutes acceptable warfare. The development of countermeasures became a crucial aspect of Allied military operations. Specialized equipment was created for detecting and disarming these devices. Metal detectors became standard issue for engineer units, though their effectiveness was limited by the Germans' increasing use of wooden casings and minimal metal components in their devices. Trained dogs were employed to detect explosives, though this had mixed success and put the animals at significant risk. Remote handling tools allowed disposal experts to manipulate suspected devices from a distance, though this was time-consuming and didn't work for all types of traps. Ultimately, human expertise and courage remained the primary defense against these weapons. The training of bomb disposal personnel represented one of the most dangerous specializations in military service. These individuals had to combine technical knowledge of explosives and mechanics with steady nerves and a kind of creative paranoia that allowed them to anticipate how a trap maker might have configured a device. They had to think through multiple scenarios, considering what they would do if they were trying to kill someone investigating this exact device. The casualty rates among bomb disposal units were high, and the psychological toll was severe. These soldiers lived with the knowledge that a single mistake, one moment of carelessness, or a trap design they hadn't encountered before, would end their lives instantly. Documentation from German military archives captured after the war revealed the systematic nature of the booby trap program. It wasn't simply individual soldiers or small units improvising defensive measures. There were standardized designs, training programs, and doctrine covering the employment of booby traps in different tactical situations. Mondes's detailed how to assess locations for trap placement, what objects would be most attractive to enemy forces, how to conceal devices effectively, and how to create integrated defensive systems where multiple traps would funnel enemies into kill zones. This institutional approach meant that as Allied forces advanced through different theaters, they encountered similar types of devices, deployed according to similar principles, suggesting centralized planning and training. The resource investment in the booby trap program reveals how seriously Germany took this form of warfare. Manufacturing facilities produced the specialized components, pressure switches, pull igniters, time delays, and modified fuses. Engineers developed new explosive compounds that could be molded into unusual shapes while remaining stable enough for transport and deployment. Technical schools trained personnel in device assembly and tactical employment. All of this required resources that a nation under increasing strain might have allocated elsewhere, but the German High Command clearly believed that tactical and psychological returns justified the investment. In the final stages of the war, as German forces conducted fighting retreats across multiple fronts, the use of booby traps intensified. Knowing they couldn't hold territory, German commanders made the deliberate choice to make every inch of ground as costly as possible for the Allies to occupy. Entire towns would be systematically rigged before withdrawal. Roads were mined and cratered, with devices placed in the obvious repair locations. Bridges were demolished and the approaches booby-trapped. Water supplies were poisoned or rigged with explosives. Food stores were either destroyed or contaminated. This scorched earth policy, enhanced by pervasive booby trapping, aimed to slow Allied advances and create massive logistical burdens. The legacy of these devices extended long past the war's end. Unexploded ordnance, including booby traps, continued to kill and injure people for decades after hostilities ceased. In former combat zones across Europe, Africa, and elsewhere, farmers would plow up old munitions. Children would find attractive-looking objects in forests or ruins. Construction workers would uncover devices that had lain dormant for years. The long-term contamination of former battlefields with explosive devices became a lasting consequence of the booby trap campaigns, one that continues to the present day in some locations. The psychological impact on survivors, both military personnel and civilians, represented another enduring legacy. People who had experienced booby trap attacks or witnessed their aftermath often developed lasting anxieties about everyday objects. Veterans of bomb disposal units suffered particularly high rates of post-traumatic stress, having spent months or years working with devices designed to kill them. Civilians who had lived through occupation and liberation in areas where booby traps were heavily employed often retained a wariness about seemingly innocent objects for the rest of their lives. The weapons and tactics developed during this period influenced post-war military doctrine significantly. Nations studied German booby trap techniques and incorporated similar methods into their own training and planning. The Cold War saw extensive development of sophisticated booby traps and improvised explosive devices by various forces. Insurgent groups and non-state actors adopted and adapted these methods, leading to the modern improvised explosive device threat that has characterized conflicts from Vietnam through to contemporary operations in the Middle East and elsewhere. The German booby trap program of World War II essentially wrote the manual for modern unconventional explosive warfare. When we examine the chocolate bar story specifically, we see it represents something true in a broader sense, even if the specific Halloween narrative lacks verification. It captures the reality that Germany did create booby-trapped items designed to look like food and luxury goods. It reflects the genuine danger that these devices posed to both soldiers and civilians, including children. It conveys the psychological horror of living in an environment where nothing could be trusted, where even the most basic human needs for food and comfort became potentially deadly. In that sense, the story serves as a kind of condensed truth about a broader campaign of terror, even if the specific details about Halloween casualties don't appear in verified historical records. The broader question this raises is about the nature of warfare and the boundaries of acceptable military conduct. Booby traps that are clearly marked, or that target legitimate military objectives, fall within the laws of war as they existed during the period, but devices deliberately designed to look like civilian items, placed where they would predictably cause civilian casualties, represent something different. They embody a philosophy of total war, where there are no true non-combatants, where creating fear among civilian populations is itself a valid military objective. This philosophy had terrible consequences during World War II and continues to shape conflicts today. Understanding this history matters because the fundamental principles haven't changed. Modern improvised explosive devices use the same psychology as German World War II booby traps. They exploit trust, curiosity, and basic human needs. They create environments of pervasive fear and suspicion. They force opponents to devote enormous resources to countermeasures. They blur the lines between civilians and combatants, often deliberately causing civilian casualties to generate terror and political pressure. The technical details have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains consistent with what German engineers developed 8 decades ago.